I'm here with Peter. How are you doing today, Peter?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. So, what is a PPE? I still don't understand what that means.
Um, Also, it's not too interesting to be fair. I studied philosophy, politics, and economics as my undergraduate degree.
Is that a
So that's
common is that a common combination that a lot of people do, or is that you're just a quirky kind of guy and you like to do different things?
yeah, it's a big course in the UK. It was started in Oxford, and some people say, hey, it's the course that runs Britain because about 200 people do PP at Oxford every year, and a lot of PP is become journalists and civil servants and politicians and all the rest of it.
Are there
So,
any famous prime ministers who had a PPE degree?
yeah, I mean, like loads of friends. So we've got David Cameron, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. We've had our fair share of. I don't know if there are. Well, yeah, if you go back, like Howard Wilson, people like that as well, going back.
We don't have a lot of politicians in America who are political science majors. So that seems like Britain might be a little more technocratic than America. We have also you have a different voting system. So you have you
Mhm.
the people vote for the party and the party. So you don't like Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak or David Cameron or whoever is, I guess, Keir Starmer. The party members select the nominee. There's no open primary process where people get to
Yes.
vote. Yeah. So that's a big difference. And I think it results in your politics being a little less populist and a little bit more. I've sort of noticed, I saw this chart the other day that was comparing the American right wing to the British right wing, and the British right wing was just so much more
Hmm.
neoliberal and less authoritarian and kind of just libertarian. And that was, I guess, I was a little bit shocked to see the difference of the magnitude because I had a lot of countries up there, and I was like, wow. America's like a third world country, and like Britain's like this advanced civilization. But obviously, structurally, I still love America, and Britain is still, we have to have a little rivalry. We have to have a
Hmm.
little bit of competitiveness. But
Yeah, us Brits are the old backwater, the former glory, now left
yeah,
behind.
yeah. I mean, I think my view of these things is like it's really cool when you run the world, and Britain was sort of trying to do that for a while, and it had a pretty good claim to doing that, and it had a pretty good shot of doing that. And the problem was that it was so successful that it speciated, that it actually gave birth to these new countries. And one of
Mhm.
them picked up where the British left off and just did it on a bigger scale with a bigger landmass, with a bigger population, more resources, and maybe a little bit of a selected spirit, meaning that like the people who went to America were just like selected for adventurousness and risk taking, and the people who left
Sure.
behind were a little bit more. Actually, concerning that, it's not just America, but Rudyard Kipling and I forget who else, but there's like two very famous British poets who were born in India, and I think even like in Africa, Tanzania, and whatever. So,
Mm.
the people who chose to go to these other places as well, they're quite prominent, even though you'd think, oh, how many British people were really living in India? It's like,
But also, we did the Americans a great favor in how we ended the 7 Years' War, I think,
what what
because
what 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 year was that? Was that the French and
63.
Indian War is what we call it in America, I think.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
We
that
don't
would that
even
would make
include
sense.
you guys. We don't even include ourselves. We
Yeah,
named it after
which
the
is
enemy
madness.
coalition.
Because then what happens is, having seized a load of territories in the Caribbean, we then hand them back over to the French and the Spanish in return for grabbing a whole load of colonies for you guys, and then you guys turn around and go, "Screw you, thanks for this territory." Bye bye.
Yeah, I mean it's a tough situation because you had all these Whigs who were moving to America, and then you had all these Whigs in the British government, and
Mhm.
there's kind of a bit of a conspiracy going on where they actually didn't really want to fight the American Revolution.
Mm.
There's probably some other examples of that throughout history where it's like they put up kind of a token effort. They were like, yeah, yeah, you're not allowed to revolt and we'll fight you and whatever. But it wasn't like Britain was like the fate of our empire rests upon us controlling America and we have to send all available
Yeah.
troops to America. So it's kind of like a bit of a, sort of like in some ways like the Soviet Winter War in Finland, where the Soviets invade Finland and they're repelled, and so a lot of people like have this weird idea that, oh, I guess the Soviet Union just like is this pitiful little country that can't even invade Finland or something. And they don't sort of take into account the fact that, when you engage in a war, uh, there's an element of decision making that takes place that decides how much of your resources should go into that war before you just say, it's not worth it.
But
Let's
also,
focus on India.
yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah, 100%. But also, I feel like um, this was this was so much the problem, the fact that there was a sort of, and there still is perhaps, a British attitude that you never want to dramatically change course too much. And so why not take this middle ground when dealing with the Americas? Instead of instead of having some firm policy on how to deal with these colonies which have very like British like institutions, and perhaps it would have made sense to have either gone harder and provided deterrence to rebellion, or to have made a settlement much sooner. But instead, there is this kind of this half-assed, just all cost strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that that strategy was a result of internal developments within the government. That there were obviously like the king and the Tory faction were just like, no, absolutely not. Rebellion must be quashed. And
Mhm.
then you had this Whiggish faction that was like, actually, we're sympathetic to the Americans and we should just have a settlement. Like, why can't we just say, like, okay, technically you're part of the British Empire, but you don't have to pay taxes to the king anymore, or something like you come up with and that had gone back and forth, like the Boston Revolt, I think 1689. Um, they revolted against the British governor, and then the British government, because it was during, I guess, the Glorious Revolution. Um, the British government was like, okay, technically you did revolt against the British government, but we also kind of are doing that here. So I guess it's okay and like all is forgiven. And they didn't like crack down
Alright.
on them. So
Hmm.
there was a little bit of whiplash of, as you say, like these kind of wildly vacillating policies where you'd have a king who was sort of tolerant and then there was more freedom. And then the king would be like, actually now we're going to impose these taxes, and they're like, wait a second, you haven't imposed any taxes in 25 years, like what right do you have to
Mhm.
impose taxes? So people were experiencing a bit of whiplash. There wasn't really a steady policy, because yeah, it was across the ocean. I mean, to get a message across took like 2 weeks and so on. So there was a bit of a disconnect there, and kind of disinterest, because actually India is producing more money. I think the Caribbean was actually like producing more profit for the British, even
Mhm.
though ultimately it would have been much more profitable to take hold of America. But it's just like the crops like tobacco and coffee and tea and sugarcane and all these things were being produced in India and in the Caribbean. And it's really, I mean, America as a landmass has a lot of stuff, but per land area, like India and the Caribbean are much more richer for that time agriculturally. Were much more valuable per square mile, as opposed to America was kind of, a little bit cold, a little bit drab, and in the hotter regions it wasn't hot enough. So it's a temperate
For sure.
zone. it turned out to be a great long-term investment, but how long
So
how long-term can you be?
what do you think would be the alternative then? Like, so
Have
let's
you
say
ever seen
Britain
the
goes,
anime Code Geass?
what?
There's an anime where the British crown relocates to North America, and Britain actually
Wait.
breaks, so it has like a Whiggish revolution and becomes like, a liberal, like Republican government, but America remains a monarchy. So that could have
Hmm.
been a solution if the king had decided to like relocate the British, which is kind of what the Byzantine Empire did, right? So Constantinople became the center of the Roman Empire. And then when Rome fell to the barbarians, they were like, "Oh, we're still doing Rome. It's just over here in the Eastern Mediterranean." So they could have pulled a switcheroo like that, where they just concentrated all their governmental force in America, and then held on to things that way. But yeah, I mean, you would have had to really had a lot of foresight and realized that these cash crops are very profitable in the moment, but in the long run, controlling North America will be much more profitable. But again, how could you convince somebody of that at the time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Ben Franklin saw it coming, but hey, but what I'm interested in is like more as a kind of on the margin policy. Suppose that Britain had said, okay, we won't tax, but the flip side of not taxing is, and the other thing that was really unpopular was also the border controls, like trying to restrict harassing Native Americans. And so, if the British government was going to say, well, we won't impose tax, but we also won't restrict you guys being really aggressive, then what's the upshot of that in the long run? So in the short run, that's great. Britain avoids war, maintains good trading relations, but in the long run, like surely this separate American power still grows and has divergent interests and
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like you have to consider what's happening on the continent as well over time, that Germany becomes this major power, which was, at the time that we're like looking at this time frame, you got the Holy Roman Empire, which is a big joke. I mean, it's this decentralized little fiefdoms and nothing going on there. The big worries about the French. So how could you know that accidentally Napoleon would unify Germany and that the results would, create a precedent with the Prussians, and that would lead to World War One and World War Two. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, if it wasn't for like let's kind of imagine a scenario where Britain goes to the colonists and say, okay, we won't tax you. We're not going to restrict you. You're going to have local autonomy. So what happens under that system is that you have all these 13 colonies, these colonial governments that are then they're not competing with the British anymore. They have no reason to unite because the Articles of Confederation, it was all about, well, we have this external enemy in the British. But before
Mhm.
that, there were actually a lot of territorial disputes between colonies. So Vermont was owned by New York, and Connecticut owned Ohio, and Georgia owned California. I mean, these were all just lines on a map. They didn't actually have settlers in California at the time. But they had all these territorial disputes where they would just take a line and draw it across the map and say, like, Connecticut now owns Ohio because it's on this parallel. Well, if the British weren't a common enemy to unite the American colonies together, then they would have had a lot more infighting between each other. And of course, that did end up coming to a civil war. Even, in our timeline, the American government supposedly was united and they still had a civil war. So, my
Mhm.
hypothesis is that had the British just left the Americans alone, do whatever you want, just send us a postcard every once in a while, but let's not have a big war over it, then the Articles of Confederation would have never taken place. The Civil War would have been much more fractious. meaning that the North would not have been able to unite under an Abraham Lincoln to crush the South. Therefore, you would have had Southern independence much more strong. And in fact, the British would have had an incentive, as they did during our timeline, to increase those divisions because they didn't want a
Mm.
big united America to oppose them. They wanted kind of them to all be divided. So as a result, I think you would have like a much more decentralized independence of each state, which each state would then kind of pursue its own imperial manifest destiny westward, and they would compete with each other. And the result of that would be that by the time of the First World War, could you really rely upon the Americans to ride to your defense? I mean, maybe some of them, maybe half of the American states would contribute to the war effort, but do you really get all of them? There were a lot of Americans, especially in the North, who actually were pretty opposed to the British Empire. And then you had a bunch of German immigrants who came over in Pennsylvania. So if Pennsylvania was an independent state and not under Articles of Confederation, would they have sent any troops to fight for Britain? No, maybe they would have joined the German side, and then they would have, had fighting in between the states in America during World War One. So World War One could have ended up looking a lot more like the 7 Years' War in that scenario. I don't know. I mean, I just think that having America as a consolidated state ended up being more beneficial to Britain than if it had been these loosely, these 13 different colonies, because then it's harder to in our timeline, it's like there's a threshold of support where once you get the American president to declare that he's going to war to save the British Empire, then it's basically all over for the Germans. Like it's just a matter of time before you win.
Yeah, sure. But I
Yeah.
suppose if you had colonies that were all under the auspices of Britain in the first place, then in 1914, assuming that the First World War would have even happened in the same way, then come 1914, Britain would be able to just recruit troops from these colonies,
Well,
like before conscription.
my contention is that not 1776. So Britain doesn't have a war with America. It says we're going to have a compromise. You Americans get to keep all your independence. You don't have to pay us any taxes. Basically, just remain British subjects under the British crown. Similar
Yeah.
to like a Commonwealth status. Like Canada today is technically part of the Commonwealth, whatever. And with the desire to say, okay, in the event of a war, we should be able to recruit some of you to fight for us. And that's the idea. But the problem with that is that it increases the already growing divisions within the American colonies. And then by the time of 1917, which is 150 years later, you have already had a version of the American Civil War, except in some ways it's gone worse, in other ways it's gone better. It's gone better in the respect that you don't have as many casualties. The only reason why the American Civil War is one of the most deadly wars in American history, besides King Philip's War, people don't know about that, but it is a very deadly war, is because you had a united North under Abraham Lincoln who was willing to suspend habeas corpus, put the draft dodgers in jail, put the rioters in jail, because there's a lot of people who opposed the idea of a war between the states. And then in the South, you had this solid South, this Confederacy that were united. So you had these two big power blocks bumping into each other. And my idea is that the Civil War still would have happened, but it would have been much smaller, and it would not have involved the entire North versus the entire South. It would have involved, a couple of southern states might have said, well, we want slavery. The British Empire is trying to abolish slavery, and so we're going to secede from the British Empire. Then the British would have said, well, you can't secede. And then it would have said, well, you guys aren't even over here. You allowed us all this autonomy and independence, so what are you going to do? And they say, oh, well, we will get the northern states to fight you on our behalf. That makes sense, right? So similar to the Civil War, except this time the northern states are much more autonomous within each other. So Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, and the abolitionist senators came from Massachusetts and Vermont and all of these different disparate states. So in this timeline, the British are able to recruit some of the northern states to fight some of the southern states, but then some of the northern states like Pennsylvania don't want to fight, or the New England draft riots, and then it becomes like a three-way war. It's the British trying to get the North to fight the South, but some of the Northerners are loyalists, but then some of them are actually sympathetic to the South, and some of them are so Whiggish that they actually prefer to have independence. And so there would be like multiple secession movements going on at the same time. It'd just be much more complicated. And that's what the South was hoping for, is they wanted a complicated war rather than just the solid North and the solid South. They wanted these border states like Maryland and Tennessee and Kentucky and Missouri to all kind of shrug their shoulders and say, it's not really our war. We don't really want to be a part of this. We're going to remain neutral. And then the Northerners would have to invade these neutral states, which would put them on the side of the South, and it would just become too big of a mess for Lincoln to win. And so I think the odds of a successful Southern secession become much higher under British imperial rule than they do in our timeline, where for Abraham Lincoln, this was like an existential war for the future of the Union, versus the British, it's just like, this is another complicated war. Maybe we should just make a deal with the South. And now the problem is you've got a divided North America, which, over time, by the time you get to World War One, now you can't really rely upon this united empire or whatever, this united landmass to support you uniformly. Maybe you retain some colonies in North America. I don't know who is the most loyalist. I mean, maybe Virginia would remain loyal to the crown or something, but then maybe the South would still have slavery and it would be against the British then. Or certain northern colonies like Massachusetts that were always rebellious, they would not be in favor. Pennsylvania would have German sympathies. So I just think in terms of World War One, it's a big problem. And also during World War Two, the reason why the Americans fought for Britain in World War Two isn't because they loved the British, but because there was this huge deal with the Japanese and the Germans. So had in our timeline, had America been divided into several different competing colonies, then the whoever took over Hawaii, maybe that would be the Confederates took over Hawaii. And so then the Japanese attack in Hawaii on this Confederate state or territory. Well, what does the North have to do with it? Maybe the North would ally with the Japanese. I mean, there's just so many
Mhm.
things to consider, and that precludes America from getting involved on the side of the British in World War II. So it just makes it a much less surefire thing that you can marshal all of all of the manpower of North America on your side. If you give it all this autonomy and independence, it's likely to be kind of like herding cats. Versus if you have one strong federal
Sure.
American system, you just like get the
I
president on your
suppose the
side.
relevance is just if it could generate enough prosperity for Britain by still having like advantageous trade terms with these places. Um, would Britain have been in the position of having to engage in a First World War? Like, would it have had any threat to British naval supremacy?
Yeah, I mean, another argument you could make is that if America was tied up, or excuse me, if Britain was really tied up in North America, because there were, Andrew Jackson was fighting the Native Americans. I think one of the Battle of Okeechobee or something in Florida was happening in the 19th century. So you can imagine a situation, also the Louisiana Purchase. When France sold the Louisiana Purchase to America, it was selling it to America as basically an ally against the British. Would the French have sold the Louisiana Purchase to the British?
Yeah,
It's
I think
less
that would have been
likely.
another conflict.
Yeah.
But that would have been interesting, right? Because then like American kind of expansionist spirit would have come up against this huge strip of French colonies. Then that would have that would have kept a sense of unification because then there would have been a common enemy external to Britain, and that would be well, who are they up against? They're up against France and they're up against Spain. And I think it would very much depend on like how Britain would manage the tensions between the colonies. Because obviously it wouldn't want the colonies to act like a completely unified bloc external to Britain, but it would want the colonies to be able to unify in the extent to the extent that it can help British foreign policy objectives, i.e., against British rivals. But I can see it working quite well in in theory. I can see a scenario in which it would work quite well in because also once Americans have like a history of fighting the French, for example, then they've got a history of fighting with the Brits against European powers.
Yeah, I mean,
Even
it didn't stop George Washington, right? He was fighting the French, and he still turned around and allied with the French against Britain. So I guess cumulatively, you're arguing if there were
yeah, but I
several
don't I don't think
wars.
Washington really allied with the French per se, right? Washington wanted independence and was happy to receive whatever support he could get from France. Um, when there was then the French Revolution and whatnot, Washington was not with Jefferson on the idea of let's intervene for the Frenchies. He was not really that antagonistic towards Britain and that sympathetic to the French. The French were just convenient supporters of independence.
Yeah, I mean, that gives a lot of context to the no entangling alliances farewell address, is that he was really referring to the conflict between Britain and France. He wasn't saying,
Mhm.
he wasn't really, making a universal philosophical proclamation. It was sort of contingent on the geopolitical situation at the time. But yeah, I mean, I think that if it had been Britain administering these colonies, their instinct, going back to these Native American treaties, they really wanted, as you said, they were interested in commerce and trade. And so, as far as they were concerned, you had these Native American nations, and every time they went to war, it was quite costly. And from the British perspective, they were like, wouldn't it just be better to make a treaty with the Native Americans and just do trade and commerce? Like, why are we going? What is this whole manifest destiny thing about? Like, we're not interested in whatever this new Zion project or whatever you have going on. This doesn't make sense. And so I could see a scenario where the British would actually be much more adverse to launching wars against, many of which were quite humiliating. I mean, the Battle of Okeechobee, I think the Americans had to retreat 100 miles back to Tampa. They weren't they didn't beat the Native Americans in that one. General Custer, so a lot of these battles were difficult and they were expensive. And the only reason the Americans were willing to continue to apply military pressure is because they had this concept of manifest destiny. And I
Mhm.
think the British were a bit more practical, and they were a little less idealistic in their territorial expansions. And they thought, like, okay, we have this empire. We could send the British military over to, Mississippi to fight the Natchez, or the Apache, or all these Native American tribes, or we could try to expand our land mass in Africa, or we could do it in Asia. And I think that when you look at that total calculation, that they would have preferred sort of to say, okay, where is the benefit the greatest and the cost the least? And they would have said, oh, let's fight in South Africa or something where we have a huge technological advantage over the Zulu, and the benefit is great because we're going to conquer all this territory. Versus the Native Americans, pound for pound, were actually relatively competitive. The only reason the Americans were able to win is because they just had a huge population. They could just kind of do almost a human wave attack. But the Native Americans had
Mhm.
guns, they had horses, they fought, guerrilla warfare. So a lot of these battles were sort of evenly matched. And I don't know that the British would have been as aggressive in westward expansion. And
Oh
as
well,
yeah,
I
go ahead.
yeah, my point was more just that I mean, this is a big reason for American independence is that the British wanted to curtail American kind of territorial aspirations. And so I think my point was more any settlement that kept the American colonies on side, I think would have to include turning a blind eye to any like rogue. And so then it'd be essentially like letting the colonies say, well, like if you want to wage this expensive thing, you guys go ahead.
Yeah, I just don't know um, how much the American colonies would have been interested in westward expansion had they remained loyal to, like, had they developed this British identity over time. I could see a lot of the people who were pioneers who were involved with westward expansion. Instead, they would have been part of, the British colonization of India. Like a lot of these people, I can see them actually leaving America and going to other places. Like I think Elon Musk's family, some of his ancestors are from Canada or America, and then they ended up in
Mm,
South Africa. So there was a lot of like kind of circulation of people going around, and I think that a lot of that kind of expansionist drive, the drive to conquer and civilize and that sort of thing, I think it would have been redirected. Maybe that's kind of a spiritual argument rather than a pragmatic argument. But it's just hard for me to see westward expansion being driven as fanatically and as intensively had America and Britain had a more, like, I look at Canada, for example. Like, Canada remains part of the British Empire, and its attitude toward the Native Americans was much lighter. It was much less genocidal, and you have a large Native population in the north. Whereas if Canada had been absorbed as part of America, I think that there would probably be less Native Americans in Canada right now than there presently are.
mm.
So I think that the character of the American state would have changed over time, even if they allowed them free
But I'm
reign at
not I'm
first.
not sure I agree because there was already this was already happening in the mid 18th century, and there was already a huge desire to run into conflicts with natives and seize land, and there was already a huge amount of land speculation. And part of that was also just to do with the the fact that America was constantly attracting a new frontier, whereas people in initially like Newfoundland, that wasn't the frontier because Quebec was was more of a frontier further westwards, and also just that the land was more desirable. There was more drive to take it in that sense. So I think the fundamentals were quite in favor of there being a push for westward expansion. Even though, yes, I'm sure that people on the very east coast could have also integrated a bit more with empire.
Yeah. So another thing that happened was like the Mormon colonization of Utah. And in our timeline, the American government viewed that as a very threatening act and put federal troops in Utah to ban polygamy and to integrate those people. Um, but I could see a British policy being like, well, these Mormons, they're certainly different, but how really? I mean, we're letting the Puritans and the Quakers and Shakers or whatever have their religious freedom, so why not the Mormons? From our perspective, what's the difference? So, as a result, I think you could get a more independent Deseret, and that sort of inspires these independence movements. And I think eventually, over time, America just gets too big for the British to govern. Already in
Yeah,
1776, it was already a little bit too big for the British to govern, not in terms of
yeah,
land mass or even sheer population, but in terms of the intellectual capital of people you were dealing with. There are just too many smart people to wrangle together. And I think that inevitably there would have been these secessionist movements, and something would have succeeded, and that means it's very hard to marshal North America in a future conflict. I guess the sort of final thing I'll say about this, this history podcast, I guess we're doing, is that there's a little bit. I mean, I'm sort of this globalist inclination. So the idea of nationalism, in Germany, for example, you had Prussian chauvinism, right? The Prussians thought they were better than the Bavarians or something. The Bavarians thought they were better than the Prussians. And you kind of look back on that and you're like, well, aren't you all just Germans or so? Like, who cares if the Bavarians technically are ruling the Prussians or vice versa, right? It's at the end of the day, it's the German Empire. And I sort of think the same thing about the Anglos. It's like, okay, well, in our timeline, America dominates Britain. In this other timeline, Britain dominates America. But aren't you all really Anglos at the end of the day? And shouldn't you just kind of like, you know,
Sure.
who really cares whether the government is led from London or from New York? This is almost like a geographical dispute. I mean, I guess we have different dialects, right? So you could say in this other version of history, I would be speaking a lot more like this right now instead of the way that I do. But I have my American accent, so that's a difference.
Not ages.
I don't know. I don't know that. I guess at the end of the day, I say that if you negate or you ignore the separation between American and British culture, which I think in the grand scheme of things is actually quite, and in certain fundamental levels, it's quite minuscule. Now, in political populist terms, how people vote and church attendance or whatever, there's bigger differences. But in terms of like, intellectuals and the tradition or whatever, it's like it's kind of actually astounding that we even have two different countries on some level, because how many countries are there in the world that speak the exact same language, have the same exact like religious tradition, political tradition, all of these things are like so similar, and yet they're supposedly these two sovereign countries. I mean, there's really no one who does that like the Anglos. Like German, I mean, I guess you could say Germany and Austria, but actually, no. I mean, that was sort of imposed on them. Like the Germans wanted to unify into a super state,
Oh,
and
there's a lot of support in Austria as well. It's just underplayed now. But to be fair, I think
I don't know. I mean, we'd have to get into that, right? So, like, what was the opinion during the Anschluss? Like, did the Austrians want to be part of Germany, or did they not want to be part of Germany? Um, but still, even then, like Austrian German and Prussian German are still like pretty distinct
oh yeah.
dialects.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
it would be like American versus real Scots or something like that. So it's just the fact that Anglos are willing to kind of tolerate these little sovereignties, like the fact that Canada exists. Okay, Canada and America have like the same exact culture. Like there's no difference here. Um, but there's like, oh, we're Canadian nationalists and we don't want to be part of America. Like, is there any other place in the world where you'd have two groups of people who are basically identical ethnically, linguistically, religiously, but they're like, no, we have to be two different countries? I mean, I guess in Taiwan versus China, you have that political division. So maybe but the Chinese and the Taiwanese kind of hate each other. Like they sort of have this like very hostile attitude, whereas Canadians and Americans aren't really willing to kill each other. They
Yeah,
just
I
want
guess
to.
the
They just
difference largely is one of temperance, and America just being so much more like frontier spirit, more libertarian coded
Yeah, I
than
mean
like
that's the
Britain
other
and
thing
Canada.
is there were several attempts by America to invade Canada. But outside of that, like America had this unique anti-imperialist ideology that, despite the fact that it did engage in imperialism, it always did it with these like caveats. I mean, the Philippines is a good example where America invaded the Philippines. It fought a war for like 9 years, and then it instantiated a Filipino parliament. And one of the weird things about it was that they were like, the entire idea of that was to get the Catholic Church out of influence and out of power because they remained behind even after the Spanish were gone. So they were like, you can have your own independent parliament, but the Catholic Church has to agree to not like play a formal role in politics anymore. And so they were really like insistent that this was like the American colonial project. Um, yeah, McKinley was very against imperialism and a lot of prominent Americans. Whereas, like, that tradition, to an extent, I mean, there was a moment in German history during the Frankfurter Parliament where there were, I mean, they hadn't even formed a government yet, but they were saying, okay, if we unite Germany under a republic, should we take over the territory of Poland as well as part of German territory? And there were liberal German nationalists who said, no, every state should have the right to its own independence and sovereignty. So there was kind of these brief flashes and moments of that. But yeah, that's another thing that makes America unique is that America will do imperialism, but it will have these moral qualms and say, well, technically it's not imperialism because we actually have a plan to liberate these people and
Hmm.
so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
it's
I don't
their
know.
own good, really.
I want to make sure. I don't know how much time you have today. We're coming to the
I'm
end of
chilling.
the.
It's the middle of the night here, so I don't have any huge constraints
Okay.
beyond my fatigue. I wanted to ask you about the the mention of the Mormons actually, because I suppose like that's a big question, right? Is like, can you have a free polygamous society? Because clearly, 19th century Americans decided like in order to make people free, we need to restrict the polygamy. That was kind of the make them free slogan applied in American life. Like, how do you think that adds up?
It's an interesting question. Um, I mean, the Mormons were not just polygamists. I mean, they were theocrats. They did believe in
Hmm.
theocracy. Um, And so, had the Mormons just been allowed general license to do whatever they want, they would have eventually formed a separate government. And I think in the aftermath of the Civil War, that was pretty taboo. Um, so I think the polygamy almost just allowed for an excuse. I think people were genuinely upset about it, and people forget that America used to have blasphemy laws. So the free speech that America enjoys today is not a that was not how people interpreted the First Amendment. So the First Amendment restricted the federal government establishing a federal religion, but it said nothing about the state governments. State governments are allowed to establish state religions. Since the Supreme Court decided to, um, reinterpret what how that had worked for a few hundred years, and they decided actually no, no state, not just the federal government, but none of the states are allowed. And part of that has just been a general drive toward federalism with desegregation. So the idea that a state is allowed to have segregation was ruled unconstitutional, which is a pretty big shift from how things were originally conceived of different states having their freedoms. So, yeah, in the case of like polygamy, I think, and if you were to talk to people at that time and say, like, if people really had freedom and religious freedom, don't you think they should be allowed to be polygamous? I mean, certainly, like Jefferson wrote that Muslims should be allowed to practice their religion, and we know Muslims are polygamous. So, what's the problem here? Why are you coming down on the Mormons? How's that consistent? And I guess that is a inconsistency when you look at the philosophy of Jefferson. But I think for the majority of Americans, they just wouldn't have, they weren't Jeffersonians, they were Hamiltonians, and they thought, American civilization is about Christianity, and Christianity means monogamy, and these people are heretics, and we can't we can't tolerate this. So Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
personally,
I get that, but so I guess there's the question of they go, this is so incompatible with like Western institutions. It's kind of an interesting thing to draw on, right? Like does the polygamous household not support individualism enough? Does it not support investment in each child enough? Kind of there's like, okay, so what's the mechanism by which we judge it to be so that polygamy really is in the end incompatible with like Western civilization?
yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues with polygamy is that well, there's a couple of issues. It represses assortative mating, so you get a lot of hypergamy. You get a lot of women who come from the lower class, and they become part of the harem of a man from the upper class, and that sort in ultimately it kind of suppresses social mobility because it's a mechanism for women specifically to increase their own social mobility via marriage, but then it kind of suppresses male social mobility. So now men don't have as much of an incentive to try to move around the ranks of society. There's kind of this equal. There's like a seesaw where the
Mm.
more hypergamy you allow women to engage in through polygamy, the less incentive you have for men to try to work their way up in society, and it generally results in these caste systems. So I think that one of the interesting things that a lot of people are mistaken on is they think, well, in the 19th century, men would just go around and they'd marry a 12-year-old because, in the past we didn't have this concept of age of consent. And anyway, and it's like that's not really true outside of certain aristocratic or fringe elements. Really, the mainstream age of marriage was like 28 for men and 26 for women, and that
In
declined.
Western European cultures,
Right. So
and then
speaking
North America,
specifically,
yeah.
you're right. But so then if we go outside of Western Europe and we go to India, and the age of consent law in India, I think 1867, um, that was controversial for the British to assign of age of consent at 12 because a young girl had died after the consummation of a child marriage, and she was 10.
Mm,
And so this
mm,
was a problem for the British. And for the Orthodox, I mean, there were two sides, right? So there were Hindu reformers who said, yeah, this sounds like a reasonable reform. And then there were the Hindu Orthodox and nationalists who said, no, absolutely not. We should never consent to anything the British try to impose on us, even if it's the right thing to do. We have to maintain our independence and so on. And so, a lot of people focus on the Muslim world and they say, like, oh, the Prophet Muhammad and Aisha, that's pedophilia, and that's something uniquely bad about Islam. I'm not actually sure that that is true. Maybe everything's on a gradient, and Islam has a more is more extreme in this respect. But I think that yeah, it's really Northwest Europe that's kind of the outlier in humanity, and that there's this
mhm,
delayed age of marriage and there's this monogamy, and that is related to the Tacitus, his description of Germanic culture as being monogamous, the Roman culture of monogamy, the Greek culture of monogamy. Those were exceptional traits. So taking those traits and continuing with them, I think there is some connection when we look at higher age of marriage, monogamy, and social mobility, and therefore meritocracy. I think that's kind of a package that's all carried together. Um,
mm.
from an individualistic perspective, if you're a man, then you're like, well, if I'm rich enough, why can't I have multiple wives? How does that harm me? Like I could still have the a woman who's very from a very good family or whatever, and I could marry her, and then I could also have these like consorts on the side. How does that really hurt me as a man? And look, now I have more children, so that benefits me. But I think collectively, what it ends up doing is it ends up suppressing assortative mating, and it ends up suppressing social mobility, and it ends up instantiating these caste systems and arranged marriage systems where you're basically buying children or these child brides. I mean, which continues to some extent today in India, where you have parents making marital decisions for children, which again happened among the aristocracy in Europe, but among the serfs and the bourgeois, um, and even just knights and petty nobles. That entire genre of courtly love was all about kind of celebrating romantic marriage over these socially assigned marriages. So that seems to be like it doesn't make necessarily, it's not appealing to, like, a lot of men would like to have multiple wives and as many kids as possible. But from a collective societal standpoint, it seems like you get better assortative mating, you get better meritocracy when you have monogamy and delayed age of marriage. Um, I mean, that's the hypothesis. Now, it's kind of like proving that statistically. I don't know if that's already been done. I don't have that on hand, but that's my
I
hypothesis.
suppose I suppose to push back in the European system, obviously there are still plenty of kings and rich noblemen who would acquire a decent number of mistresses. But because there wasn't a formalized harem system, the number of mistresses would be less than someone in an equivalent social position would be fewer than someone in an equivalent social position in a more polygamous society. I suppose the other big difference is that there's still a huge emphasis on legitimate versus illegitimate children. So there's still going to be a nuclear family with high investment per child with amongst like the legitimate kids, basically. And that still seems so maybe there's importance in nuclear family in terms of development, in terms of individualism. Obviously, Henrik's associated like how nuclear family are you, of how individualistic your society is, how you score an openness. Openness is the big personality predictor of income, individual level, perhaps societal level too. I mean, yeah, these things. I like maybe it does explain a lot, but then it's interesting that you've got Americans making this argument in the middle of the 19th century who were not really anthropologists or anthropologists rather. Um, but but yes, and I wonder if there's anything more to it or not than just the like I don't think just the human capital investment makes sense. Interestingly enough, so I was on, Simon Lard.
Yeah, I did a little interview slash debate with him.
Yes, so he mentioned earlier because I was doing an interview with him, and anyway, I was discussing with him, and I mentioned something that I want to ask you about if you've got the time and you're not too
Yeah,
shattered.
we have at least 7 more minutes,
At least 7 minutes,
at
incredible,
least.
incredible. And gosh, what was I saying? Yes, long run growth after the Black Death. The two countries that start having long run growth, it's England and Holland, and no other country initially. And that's very peculiar. And it's also very interesting because if you look at Emmanuel Todd's family types, he says that England and Holland are the only absolute nuclear family societies. And in much of the rest of Northern Europe, it was a STEM nuclear family system whereby the eldest son still like lives at home and is raised at home and inherits that homestead. Whereas absolute nuclear family, every child is expected to leave home, including the heir, as it were, when they marry. have their own like wife and kids. And that seems interesting. Whereas like the STEM nuclear families, bit more collectivist, bit more authoritarian minded. It kind of figures with, hey, the heir still needs to live at home for a long time. Doesn't just go off and make their own household.
Okay.
And so maybe that figures with.
I'm not
Sorry.
sure that that claim is correct, that only England and Holland. So I have an article called Natalism is Bad for Innovation, where I argue why we should have a lower
Mm.
population. And if you look at the years from 1360 to 1450 in Italy, central northern Italy, um, the real wages of building laborers was increasing. Then you have here another um, another graph of wages, and so it does show Holland not really increasing very much after
Yeah,
the Black Plague, but it shows Italy going up significantly. England is sort of flatline Sweden. So I actually don't think. I mean, from what I'm looking at is wages here. Now there's other data that he's looking at where he would say, oh well, you don't look at wages, you look at some other measure of economic productivity. But from what I'm looking at, it's really Italy. And that to me corresponds with my knowledge of history that after the Black Plague, the country that really advanced artistically, culturally, in the Renaissance was Italy. It wasn't England or
yeah, but
Holland.
these were short term booms. If we're talking about like long term growth,
Well, I'm talking about a
basically,
hundred years. That's the entirety of the Renaissance. It's
no, no,
not.
no, because no, because I disagree. Because if we're talking about long run growth, you're talking about a period where all of the factors of production are replaced. But a lot of capital, like a lot of buildings back then, would last for a decent period of time. And Italy already has a higher economy prior to the Black Death than most of Europe, which figures in terms of its pre-existing history and its geography. Now, after the Black Death, England and Holland begin this sort of very slow upward trend. But sure, maybe Italy has like benefits from something a load more capital per worker, and so has higher growth. Also, it was very fluctuating with Italy because of trade, because changing trade relations has the ability to really just like jog growth because like suddenly you have this division of labor between two countries. So as soon as you have better trade relations, your economy can really go like bam. But that doesn't necessarily represent long run growth. Where long run growth we're talking about like actual increase in total factor productivity. So sure, so I'm not surprised by the wages data, and I've seen that Italy was doing better in the immediate run after the Black Death. But there is this paper that's estimating that the only two countries that had long run growth following the Black Death were England and Holland.
Yeah, I
Um,
could look those up. Yeah, I only have the wage data, and it shows that England and Holland didn't pop off until the 16th century. Which again, actually, so Holland, 1520 really was spiking, and then England really didn't. It was 1670. So much, it sort of came in waves.
but England is already a lot richer than most of Europe by 1600. So,
That's
but
interesting.
and in
Yeah, not
13,
according to this data. It had lower wages than
oh,
Holland and
I
Italy. So you'll have to send me the paper. I can send
yeah, yeah,
you.
we'll
Yeah,
have to compare definitely. But my understanding is that by 1600, England is already one of the richer countries. 1300, England is one of the poorer countries. So there's been a trend change. And in the Dutch case, their economic output is just highly volatile in the 300 years after the Black Death. But so I think their trend is still upwards, but it's very highly volatile. So that's why you might see a spike at like 1520, for example. But yeah, 100%. It's not clear because we only have so much data from these times. It's like, how are you to say, oh, that was long run growth versus like that was that there's enough noise that you could kind of spot a false trend. I agree with you. But it's still interesting, and I think the fact that England goes from one of the poorer countries to one of the richer countries, assuming that my data is correct on that, I understand that you're looking at something that contradicts that, and that the Dutch really saw ahead as well, so that they're like over twice as rich as the European average by 1600. This is kind of that's kind of interesting stuff. But so if that is accurate, then that's interesting that hey, these countries have distinct family norms according to Todd's vision. And according to the paper I looked at based on like the Madison Project research, then they also had this initial long run trend growth. And that's kind what's your natalism argument, by the way? Because
What's
I
my
this is the thing
natalism
I wanted
argument?
to ask you about.
Yeah, I mean, the Black Plague was pretty good, I guess, is the argument. Obviously, having a huge welfare state centered on old people, which I don't know what the European figure is, but America, $1.35 trillion on Social Security every year. That's not including, we often don't under or calculate like the cost of private spending. But that is a cost. Like people privately spend on elder care, and
Mm,
so obviously in the short term, people would say, "Oh well, we need natalism to take care of these old people." And that is a short term solution potentially. But in the long term, what does that result in? It results in a larger global population. And the question is whether you need population growth absolutely to have economic growth. And I think the Black Plague, at least in Italy, shows it's not really as clear of a correlation as people make it out to be. And, there's reasons for that relating to land ownership and social mobility and feudalism and the origins of capitalism. And you can make a detailed argument about whether that applies to our situation or not. I would make an argument based on industrial pollution that actually there are economic costs associated with pollution that are ignored. There are healthcare
mm,
costs. There are cognitive costs. There are genetic costs
mhm,
to pollution that are a result of the scale of global population. And so when you take that into account, then I think there's a pretty good economic case to be made for antinatalism, at least in relative terms, right? I'm not philosophically advocating that no one anywhere at any time have children. Um, but I think my position is like, uh, it's just kind of injecting some nuance, like as opposed to the natalist argument that yes, children are an absolute economic good, no matter what. Um, it stimulates economic activity, it stimulates growth. I think if the Black Plague had never happened, it's pretty hard for me to see like does Europe eventually become as powerful and as wealthy over time? Maybe in absolute terms, but I mean, I don't know. I think that the Black Plague probably accelerated things by a century. That would be my guess. Is that if
yeah,
that didn't happen, we would probably not have cars right now, which is pretty dramatic to think about.
I think it's interesting. I really like these sorts of these sorts of topics. I'd definitely be interested in reading. So is this post out now on Black Death,
This
or is
was
this up and
posted like a
coming?
year ago or something.
Ah, so I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
I want to read that and perhaps post a reply. I think that would be I think that'd be interesting. But so I agree. Like there's the classic argument, and you can see European wages generally where Black Death comes along, like half the population's gone. Suddenly there's loads more land and capital, like your shovels and your fences and your barns left over per worker. And so the workers are more productive. But most European countries, in like the 50 years after the Black Death, their economy, their output booms, and then it just flatlines again. So if you look at like the R world in data graphs on GDP per capita in Europe, then most countries like Germany, France, Italy, from what I remember looking at, it goes like bam after the Black Death, and then it's flat again. And so that's not like long run trend growth. That's just a one off like, oh yeah, there was a bit of extra surplus going around and we could organize things a tiny bit better. But that's not long run. So I think like long run growth still depends on moving past just thinking about worker to capital and land ratios and relies on, okay, are we actually going to increase productivity? Which is where innovation's relevant, which is also then where population's relevant because obviously more people. But obviously it's not as simple as that because generally it's educated people. So it's like more human capital units than more innovation. So obviously, if we had like 100, if we had a TFR or like total fertility rate of 100, then that would probably not be great for economic growth per capita because we probably wouldn't be able to invest much in the average kid. But could you maintain decent human capital with TFR of 2, 2.5, 3? I mean, Israel's at 3 with good human capital levels. And so that seems
Yeah.
like conceivable.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about Israel is that, I mean, that's a particular case where I think a lot of the fertility is downstream of the Orthodox. And I think the Orthodox are like a theocratic. Um, so
Oh
that
yeah, no, I'm not saying whether Israeli I've not made any claim so far about like oh how replicable is Israeli TFR. I'm just saying in Israel they have a TFR of 3 and they have good levels of human capital.
well,
Now
okay,
you could
so
say like
yeah.
let's exclude the Haredis
Well,
because
no, 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 no.
they're
I'm not even. I'm saying that. So
yeah
there's a blog called Non-Zionism, and he has a really popular article called, maybe you've already seen it, but it's like
yeah
explaining Israeli fertility. And so his argument, I think it's convincing, is that you need the ortho. It's not that like, okay, well, what if we just exclude the Haredi and then we maintain the rest? Maybe it's only 2.7 or whatever it is. Um, his argument is that's not really possible. Is that you have a kind of an onion model of culture, and the Orthodox are at the center of it, and they kind of bleed out into these other people. And so my argument would be that is it possible to have a country like Israel right now with the Orthodox right now? Well, obviously that country exists, but is that sustainable model going forward? That's where I start to ask questions about, like, if the Orthodox population continues to double every 20 years, what does that mean for the future of Israeli
yeah.
democracy? So there's a lot of when people say like, oh well, we should just be like Israel. It's like, oh, so you want Christian fundamentalists running the government? Okay, I mean, if you do, I mean, respect. I mean, as long as we're being honest about what we're gonna get, is we're not gonna have democracy at the end of
but
that experiment. Like,
but
then
I still think you're getting distracted from my so I agree that that's a very interesting question. Is like the pardon me. What's the extent to which we can actually take lessons from Israel when we're thinking about fertility rates? But what I meant was I'm just making just on the debate of economic growth per capita and I'm gonna get my pen and fertility rates in Israel, we have a case of a country with a TFR of 3 and it still has decent human capital
yeah,
and
but
therefore still
I don't
is
think
pretty
that's
innovative.
sustainable. I don't think that's how Israel was founded. Israel wasn't founded with its current demographic profile. Israel was founded by secular Jews whose
Yeah,
for
I
yeah.
know, but I'm just saying on the level of is it possible to still have good human capital levels with a TFR of 3?
I guess
Can you
I'm
still
saying
invest
no.
enough in the education?
I'm saying
But
it's
why are you saying no?
impossible. Um,
Sorry?
I'm saying no because when you introduce any natalist incentive, which the only incentive that actually works is religious, but people can disagree with that. But any incentive that you introduce is going to have a differential impact on the population. And what you essentially end up doing is you end up selecting for a population that's more sensitive to those incentives. So, for example, if you say, we're going to give more money to religious schools as a way to increase fertility. I mean, that's basically what Israel does. Is it funds Haredi schools for them to study Torah, and then they have a lot of kids. We're going to give fertility, we're going to give welfare to people who have large families. Okay, that benefits the Haredi. They take advantage of that. So what you end up with a population in 60 years is a majority Haredi population. And, you can say, well, the Haredi, they have just as much human capital as anyone else. Well, people say that, but in actuality, like they haven't really proven that because they have a very high unemployment rate and they don't contribute productively to
Yeah.
the economy. They have a huge welfare usage rate. So my contention would be that no, every natalist policy that you introduce will result in this kind of selective promotion of certain types of people who have a certain human capital profile, and you're going to lose human capital as a percentage of your population,
Well, so
even if
I
in
want to,
total,
can I,
yeah,
sorry.
in total, yes. Natalism, everyone has more kids, right? So even your high human capital people have more kids, right? And so all ships rise and then everything's great. The problem is in a democratic system, the way that like things are ultimately administered in the long term, you have to be concerned with these proportions. You can't just focus on the absolute increase. So while for the economy, you can make this argument. I guess there's a governmental problem, and I would rather have a situation where, and I would point to you to the data from Norway, and also data out of America, which shows a trend where men who make more money have more children. Now, for women, it's the inverse, but that trend is softening over time. So the slope of the curve is decreasing. It's becoming a flatter curve. And so the idea here is that if you supersaturate the population with antinatalism, which is functionally feminism, you supersaturate people with feminism. And at first, only the smartest, most avant garde people adopt feminism, and their fertility crashes. And then the fertility of the working class is relatively high. But if you continue this process ultimately and you get working class people to be just as feminist as upper class people, you eventually reach a point where actually you get higher fertility among the most educated. Now, that seems like a fantasy for people looking at the data today, but if you look at the change in fertility rates over time for each of these categories, I think that's the conclusion of this process. Um, and I think the more feminist the country is, the more you get this kind of a pro-education fertility. And so that would be my argument in favor of that. Of in the long run, you want to have this kind of reproductive profile. You don't want a situation where you say, well, in the short run, natalism is good. It'll be good for the economy, because then you end up with these structural governmental problems with
Mm.
democracy. Even without democracy, you can still have demographic problems. So that would be my
So
argument.
yeah,
We'll have to
I
wrap
mean,
it up because our 7 minutes has expired.
outrageous.
I know it is
So
outrageous.
you're gonna force correct the last word.
I didn't know you're the only person who asks me questions. I will give you the last word though.
Okay, sure.
You're on the floor.
Well, I think you've endogenized the the issue of human capital, and therefore you've contradicted my claim by making my claim stronger than the one I was trying to make. I was just trying to make a claim of right now there is a case of having 3 children per woman and still producing good human capital rates. Now, I think the stuff that you raise is very interesting, and therefore, hey, it just seems like physically workable that you can do this. Now, obviously, there's a question of, well, what are the cultural components? What are the actual welfare components? And what would therefore be the long term effects, which I think is very interesting. Although I also think a lot of pronatalist measures do look at raising the fertility of educated people, like, for example, German maternity policy changes in 2007, or, like, for example, like French tax code. looks at specifically how we tax families and therefore is incentivizing tax-paying families to have more children. So I think there are there are already measures that are thinking about what's the productive, like down the line, productive effects of natal policies. But but yeah, there's the interesting culture question, which perhaps if I wanted to give you my full thoughts on would extend this by more than you want right now. But that would be my initial response to what you've just thrown out.
Awesome. Do you have grand meta narratives to cast, or things to promote, or articles to preview? Anything you're working on you want to let people know about?
Um, well, right now I've got a draft policy doc on pronatal stuff that I'm trying to get out in the UK, but it's quite a boring doc because it's just kind of marginal policies that might be sort of politically feasible. But that may be of some interest. I post my ruminations on the Substack, some of the stuff about the Black Death and economic growth. I did a post in November on that, so go check that out if that was interesting. I'm going to shortly write a reply to Deep Left Analysis is 1 year old post on the Black Death in Italy. So keep your eyes posted for that as well.
Awesome, Peter. Great conversation. Uh,
Yeah, it's been fun.
thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
All
All
right,
right.
all
Take
good.
care. Bye bye.
You too. Bye.
There we go. Got to switch over now.